So, as we all know, Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, passed away this past Thursday, a day before my birthday, believe it or not. And a lot of tributes have been pouring in, and also a lot of people have talked about, the good and the bad personally when it came to Terry Bollea, the guy behind Hulk Hogan. And, I've done my own videos as well. I even talked about why, even after Hulk left in '93, Vince was determined to find the next Hulk Hogan, even starting back then. And there's a lot of other things about Hulk that, people will wonder about, and people will give their own explanation and reasoning for. And I think, honestly, one of the big questions a lot of people are going to have looking back on him is, I guess you could say his exaggerationness, if you will, his exaggerationness, if that's a word. Basically him, kind of twisting and bending reality in certain events, to his, his whim, basically to include himself in there. And honestly, we can all rack it up to maybe he's been hit in the head too many times, with chairs and championship belts and so on. And that might be true, if not is indeed true. But also we have to realize that Hulk was brought up in a time where wrestling was still viewed from an old school perspective. In other words, he was brought up at a time to where, Hall of Famers, the Hall of Famers that we know of today that are still with us, as we speak, some that are unfortunately not with us, like Hulk anymore, they were raised up in a time to where they always tried to keep kayfabe, if you will. They tried to keep things, on the down low. They didn't, allow the business to be exposed, as much as it is now. They basically would do what they could to, keep it as real to the fan, to the viewer at home as much as they could. And that would even include exaggerationness. And what I mean by exaggeration is basically bending and twisting the truth to the point that, nowadays you look back at what they're saying and you're like, that's not possible. And then, you have actual people, that get mentioned because of the association with whatever the wrestler brings up in the conversation. You have those people coming out and saying, yeah, that's not true. I don't know where he or she is coming from, with that. And that's what Hulk, to me, was doing. He was trying to keep things, in my opinion, old school, kayfabe, if you will. He was trying to, stick to the roots of what he was brought into. He was trying to basically, make, in my opinion, he was trying to make up all these different stories because of who he was, because of the magnitude and impact that he had, not just on the wrestling business, bringing it into the mainstream, but the whole mainstream sports entertainment, genre as a whole. Hulk basically saw, that influence he had and figured, well, hey, people even today will believe anything. They believe anything the internet says, so why not believe something that one of the greatest pulp culture icons of all time, if not the greatest, why not believe what he has to say? And I think that's why he would, make up certain things. That's why he would come up with the idea that, he wanted to be the original Triple H back in 1990, when more than likely that wasn't true. This is why he would come up and make up stories of, oh yeah, Metallica wanted me to join them and be the front, bass man or something like that. And that wasn't true. He would bring up things of, he was there, or at least he was in the know about the Montreal screw job and stuff like that. And even though that's not true, he would say it. He would say it because of how he was brought up in the business. And again, he was brought up in an old school way to where you keep kayfabe alive, no matter how ridiculous it may sound. And that includes exaggerationness. That includes basically, telling, fabrications, if you will, of events, that never included you by including you. See what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying? That's what Hulk did. That's what Terry did. He would basically fabricate, exaggerate, certain events that did happen, but they didn't include him originally, but to basically, play into the kayfabe, play into the old schoolness. And because of, who he was and the impact he had on the business, he added himself because he knew people, or he believed people would believe what he was saying. They would believe Metallica wanted him in the band. They would believe he wanted to be the original Triple H. They would believe that he was in the know about the Montreal screw job, and so on and so forth. Basically, that's why Hulk would do this. That's why he would make up these stories, even though they'd be contradicted. What's the word I'm looking for? Hold on. Even though they'd be contradicted, by a lot of other people, and they would, sometimes show proof. Hulk still stuck to his guns. He stuck to his guns, and that, going into, an era of social media and internet and YouTube and all that, maybe he shouldn't have, continued those claims as much as he did. But again, he was just, in my opinion, sticking to being old school, being kayfabe, basically trying to keep the business, secretively still real to the viewers and the fan. Even in a day and age that we're in now. That's why he did it. Let's be honest. I don't think he believed anything coming out of his own mouth, all right? And God has forgiven him for that, there's no doubt. But even I believe, in my opinion, just my opinion, I believe he doesn't believe a word that came out of his mouth, but he knew that even though maybe what he was saying was not true in his mind, or he did indeed know that what he was saying was not true, let me correct myself there, even though he knew maybe what he was saying was not true, he knew that he was staying true to the business. He was staying true to old schoolness. He was staying true to kayfabeness. He was doing all that because that's how he was trained and brought up in the business. He wasn't trained and brought up to expose the business or, be like this or be like that. No, he was trained to keep things, secretive. And if that meant, in his mind, exaggerating the truth, fabricating the truth, including himself into certain events that he was never part of, or he never really knew about, then so be it. That's how he was brought up in the business. And he's not the only one. He's not the only one. There's a lot of men and women Hall of Famers in wrestling, men and women athletes across the board that were brought up during an age and a time frame where they were taught, to have respect for the business, the genre they were part of, but to also basically be old school, kind of keep it old school. And maybe they were taught that one of the best ways to be old school is to make exaggerations, make false claims, fabrications, if you will, of things that you were never a part of, but because you are who you are, people will believe it. This is why Jeff Siegel, the Slick Daddy of OTR Central, when he talks about Michael Jordan's career, in sports, and basically him going from basketball to baseball, he doesn't include the baseball part. He includes the Space Jam part. Because what he's doing is he's going and looking at it from an old school perspective of, if you were a kid watching Space Jam for the first time back then in the 90s, and you met Michael Jordan in his mind, in Jeff's mind, would be the kind of person that would look at that kid and not even bring up the baseball part, but bring up, I had a lot of fun playing with the Looney Tunes. We saved the universe. That's what Jeff Siegel does. That's what he does when you bring up Michael Jordan's baseball career. He doesn't acknowledge it. He looks at it like it never happened, but the Space Jam thing happened. That's what he does. He fabricates, he exaggerates, something that, even though it was fiction and we watched it as a movie, he'll exaggerate and fabricate as reality because he doesn't want to acknowledge the baseball thing. And I know that sounds a little kind of weird to, use as a comparison's sake, or for comparison's sake. But, that's basically, when you think about it, what Hulk was doing. He was fabricating a lot of stuff. He was exaggerating a lot of stuff that he was never a part of. That he's never heard of. And if he heard about it later on, he looked at that as, hey, that's a great story I can include myself into, and people would believe it. So that's why, at the end of the day, Hulk did what he did, in my opinion. That's why he would go out and exaggerate claims, if you will. Exaggerate claims of, I was there when this happened, or this band asked me to be part of them, or I heard about what was going to happen here before it happened, and because he was an old school soul, that basically that was trained to have respect for the business, and basically trained to keep it kayfabe and a secretive even to his last day. And that's a fact. And I think that's what we all have to look at. We all have to look at the fact that he was keeping things on the down low. As crazy as some of his stories were, as whacked out as some of his stories were in the eyes of a lot of folks, he did it mainly because he was trained in the old school manner. And he was looked at as a larger than life character. A larger than life character. I mean, he's put up there in the upper echelon of pop culture icons like Michael Jackson and a Michael Jordan, if you will, like a Joe Montana, and so on. He's put up in that echelon. He's put up in, the echelon of an Optimus Prime, if you will. But from a real life perspective, Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, you name it. He's put Larry Bird. He's put up in an upper echelon of pop culture icons that have done cross media, that have crossed over from one genre to the other. And because of those impact on pulp culture, the impact on the business they made a name for themselves in, they are the kind of people that, when he was alive, if you would have gone up to Michael Jackson and he was alive, and asked him about certain things, or if you were to interview him, and he's been interviewed several times, don't get me wrong, but if he was still alive today, and you were to interview him, he'd be the kind of person that might do an exaggeration, a fabrication of something that he was never part of. Michael Jordan may not do that right now, but over time, you never know. I mean, I'm sure he did it back when a young kid who watched Space Jam in '96, he probably did it then, and there you go. You get what I'm saying, right? You get what I'm saying? It's all about adding to the allure, the mystique, the majesty of who the character was. Because if they say I was part of this, even nowadays, people will believe it. Even though they'll look it up and probably find out it's not true, they'll still accept it as semi-truth, or they'll still accept it as, they may have made that up, but I'm going to accept it as truth because I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they did know about something, or at least they heard about something or whatever. They would do that. So in closing, what I'm trying to say is, Hulk made up a lot of stuff, included himself into things that he never was a part of, and everything. But at the end of the day, I think the reason he did it, in my opinion, my point of view, is he was staying true to the business. He was being old school. He was being, someone that wasn't a fan of kayfabe. He was someone that kept things on the down low, if you know what I mean. And because he knew of the cultural impact he made, if you will, the cultural impact he made on the business, just like those I mentioned, on their respective genres. That is why he would go out and say these things. Because he knew that because of who he was, there's a good chance that even before and after social media's existence, people would believe him. They would believe him maybe enough to look it up to see if there's any truth. And even if they knew it wasn't, or even if they knew what he was saying true, they would still keep it as truth. And you know why? Because like I said, they feel that Hogan would be the kind of guy that would probably hear about something like that before it happens, or maybe know about it before it happens, and then it happens, if that makes any sense. But yeah, to me, I think that's why Hulk said what he did. Should he have, exaggerated and added himself to all these things and said that this happened and that happened and all that? No, of course not. He shouldn't have. He should have just stayed the course, if you will. He should have just stayed the course. He should have stayed truthful. He should have just said, he should have just told it like it is. But again, he comes from that age of old school wrestlers, of old school athletes, to where, if you're a bigger than life pop culture icon from whatever genre you're a part of, people are going to look at you with reverence. They're going to look at you as, I'll believe anything that person says. And they would, even in today's social media. And that's a fact. I mean, Hulk, and let's be honest, Hulk is not the only one from that time frame to make up stuff. He's not. There's a lot of people that have been interviewed from that time frame that have made stuff up. I mean, heck, Billy Jack Haynes pretty much makes up everything he talks about sometimes. You want a good example of someone that's even more exaggerated and fabricated than Hogan? Billy Jack Haynes is a good example. He is. And there's others. I mean, I'll give another example. A good friend of Hulk's, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Thank God he's still around today. Hacksaw will exaggerate. Demolition, Axe and Smash, even on their own podcast will exaggerate. And make up things that may or may not be true, or they may or may not have been a part of. Like I said, same with Hacksaw. Same with JBL. And so on. The point is, when you come from a certain time frame, basically the late early 80s to mid 80s and late 80s, if you will, but mainly the late early to mid 80s, when you come from that time frame and you're told to keep true to your character even into the 90s, keep true to your character even into the 90s, it's hard to let that go. It's hard to let that go. It's hard to basically, transition from that world to the real world. And when you get interviewed, just, tell it like it is, and all that. Kind of just, reminisce of old days and along the way not make up anything that's not true. It's hard to do. It is hard to do. And that is why I think Hulk did what he did. I think that's why Hulk always did what he did. But like I said, he's not alone. There are others that have done the same thing. Maybe not as much as him, but there are others. But like I said, if you want to make a comparison, Billy Jack Haynes, basically has Hulk beat in that department. End of discussion. But like I said, it's because I believe he came from that time frame. That's why he did it. And like I mentioned earlier, and maybe it's the hulkamaniac in me that's being a little biased, but I truly believe, in my opinion, that Hulk never believed anything he was saying when it came to those fabrications and exaggerations. I don't think he believed anything he said, but because of the way but again, like I said earlier, because of the era he was brought into, when it came to wrestling, the era he became a pop culture icon in, that is why I think he does this. Because he was taught to be old school. He was taught to keep it on the down low, if you know what I mean. Keep it as secretive as you can, and basically tell tall tale stories, if you will, or fabrications or exaggerations of events that you were either a part of or not a part of, or you heard about, not heard about, and so on. That is the era of time he was brought into, and he just happened to be the one that catch that lightning in a bottle at that time and became who he was. And because he became who he was, people believed a word. Well, not. Let me hold on. Got a little tongue-tied there. But like I said, because he was brought up in the time that he was brought up in, and everything as a wrestler, and he caught that lightning in a bottle and became the mainstream pop culture icon that he was, and still is looked at, to this day. That is why he would he would say these things. He would exaggerate. He would fabricate, because of that mystique, that aura, like I mentioned earlier, that he would just resonate. He would resonate, and it would attract people to him. And because of that, he knew that, in my opinion, even though what he would say would not be the truth, he knew people would believe it, because he was raised in an old school manner. Like I said, he's not as fabricated or exaggerated as someone like Billy Jack Haynes, but again, I think it's mainly because Hulk was brought up in that old school mentality. That's why. He's brought up in an old school mentality. But that's all I want to really say here. Just give my thoughts on it. Let me know what your thoughts are overall. Do you think I have a point in what I said? And yeah, that's about it, guys. So until next time, like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel, share the video. Like I said, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notification, like the video, share the video, click on the links in the description to find my content elsewhere outside of YouTube, as well as click on the Teespring store for merchandise you can't get anywhere else. Sorry for that little stumble, guys. It is summer break, and everything. You know how that is. And I also got my third oldest nephew here for a few days. So, yeah, just try to come on here and do this. And until next time, I am out.